There was a man in the town of Keldra who had been drawing maps for 50 years. His name was Tobias, and his shop was on a narrow street near the river, between a locksmith and a shop that sold wool. The sign above the door was hand-painted, Tobias Kern, cartographer, and it had been repainted 3 times in 5 decades, always in the same dark green letters, always in the same careful hand. The shop was small and full of light. The front wall had a large window that looked onto the street, and in the mornings the sun came through it and fell across the wide wooden table where Tobias worked. The table was covered with maps, some finished, some half-drawn, some just beginning. They were pinned to the surface with small brass tacks, and the wood underneath was stained with decades of ink and pencil marks. The walls were covered, too, from floor to ceiling with maps of every size and kind. Maps of the town, maps of the surrounding valley, maps of rivers and mountain paths and forests, and the old trade routes that had once connected Keldra to the towns on the other side of the mountains. Tobias drew every map by hand. He used ink and fine-tipped pens that he ordered from a supplier in the city. He used rulers and compasses and a magnifying glass for the smallest details. His lettering was precise and beautiful, each place name written in a style that he had developed over the years, a style that was neither too formal nor too casual, but simply clear. Anyone could read a Tobias Kern map, even from across the room. He had learned the craft from his father, who had learned it from his father before him. 3 generations of mapmakers, all in the same shop, all drawing the same valley and the same mountains and the same river. But each generation had added something new. His grandfather had mapped the old footpaths that connected the farms. His father had mapped the new roads that were built after the war. Tobias had mapped everything else: the streams, the forests, the boundaries of fields, the locations of wells and bridges and churches, and the small stone shelters that shepherds used in the high pastures during summer. His maps hung in offices and homes throughout the valley. The hotel near the lake had one framed in its lobby. The school had one in its hallway, showing the town with small illustrations of the important buildings, the church, the town hall, the old mill by the river. Hikers bought his trail maps and carried them folded in their jacket pockets, the paper growing soft and worn along the creases over years of use. Some people kept his maps the way other people keep paintings, not because they needed directions, but because the maps were beautiful and because they showed a place they loved in a way that felt true. But nobody needed hand-drawn maps anymore. Tobias knew this. People used their phones now. They typed an address, and a blue line appeared on a screen and told them where to go. It was faster and more convenient, and it worked almost everywhere. Tobias did not resent this. He was not the kind of man who complained about the way the world changed, but he continued to draw his maps, because drawing them was what he did, and because he believed that a hand-drawn map showed something that a screen could not just where things were, but what they felt like, how the land moved and breathed and held itself together. On a morning in early October, a young woman came into the shop. Her name was Alma, and she had moved to Keldra 3 weeks earlier to take a job at the district planning office. She was 26, with short dark hair and round glasses that she pushed up her nose when she was thinking. She had studied geography at university, and she had always loved maps. Not the digital kind that lived on screens, but the real kind, the ones you could touch and fold and spread across a table. She had heard about Tobias from a colleague at work. The colleague had mentioned him casually, the old mapmaker on River Street, the last one in the region who still drew by hand. Alma had been curious. She had come to look, not to buy. She was not sure anyone still bought hand-drawn maps. She stood inside the door for a moment and looked around. The maps on the walls caught her attention immediately. She moved closer to one, a large map of the valley,
drawn in brown and green ink, showing every contour of the land, every bend in the river, every cluster of houses that formed the villages scattered across the hillsides. It was detailed in a way she had not expected. But it was more than detailed, it was alive. The lines had energy. The hills seemed to rise from the paper. The river seemed to move. Tobias was sitting at his table, working on something. He was a tall man, thin and straight-backed, with white hair cut short and hands that were steady despite his age. He looked up when she came in, but did not speak. He waited for her to approach, the way a person waits who is used to being alone and does not mind it. Alma told him she worked at the planning office. She told him she had studied geography at university in Munich, where she had spent 4 years looking at maps on screens, satellite images, topographic databases, 3-dimensional terrain models that could be rotated and zoomed and measured down to the millimeter. She had learned to read the land through numbers and data. But standing in this shop, looking at these maps, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She told him she had never seen maps like his. Tobias listened. When she finished, he asked her which map she had been looking at. She pointed to the valley map. He nodded. He told her he had drawn it 8 years ago, and that it was already out of date. A new bridge had been built to the south, and 2 of the farms near the eastern ridge had been abandoned, and their fields had returned to forest. A map, he said, was always a picture of a moment. The land did not stay still. Alma asked if she could watch him work. He looked at her for a moment, a long, quiet look, as if he were deciding something, and then he nodded.
She came back the next day, and the day after that. At first, she told herself she was doing research, that understanding how the valley had been mapped in the past might help her with her planning work. But that was not the real reason, and she knew it. Her job at the planning office was busy, and she spent her days looking at digital survey data and zoning regulations and development proposals. The work was useful and necessary, but it was also flat. It lived on screens. It was made of numbers and coordinates and legal categories. It did not breathe. In Tobias's shop, everything breathed. She sat on a stool near the window and watched him draw. He was working on a new map of the old town center, a commission from the local history society, who wanted a detailed illustration of how the streets and buildings had looked 50 years ago, before the new ring road had been built and several old streets had been demolished. The work was slow. He would spend an entire morning on a single block of buildings, drawing each roofline and doorway and window with careful, measured strokes. He worked from old photographs and from his own memory. He had walked these streets as a boy and remembered things that the photographs did not show. The color of a particular door, the shape of a tree that had grown in someone's garden, the angle of a lane that had curved slightly to the left before it reached the river. Alma watched his hands. They moved the way a musician's hands move, not with speed, but with certainty. Every line was placed where it needed to be. There were no mistakes, or if there were, she could not see them. She asked him once if he ever made errors. He said he made them constantly, but he had learned to correct them so smoothly that no one noticed. That, he told her, was the real skill. Not avoiding mistakes, but knowing how to fold them back into the work so that they became part of the whole. She thought about this for a long time afterward. At her desk in the planning office, looking at the clean lines of a digital survey, she thought about mistakes folded back into the work. She thought about the difference between precision that came from a machine and precision that came from a human hand, how one was perfect and the other was something else, something that contained the trace of the person who had made it. 3 weeks after they met, Tobias told Alma something that surprised her. He said he was going to stop. He was 73 years old, and his eyes were not as sharp as they had been, and his hands, although still steady, grew tired more quickly than before. He had decided that the map of the old town center would be his last. After that, he would close the shop. Alma felt something drop inside her chest. She had known, in a logical way, that he could not do this forever, but hearing him say it made it real.
She asked him what would happen to the maps. He said he had thought about donating them to the town archive. There were hundreds of them, maps he had drawn over 50 years, maps his father had drawn, a few fragile ones from his grandfather's time. Together, they formed a record of the valley that did not exist anywhere else, not in any database, not in any photograph, not on any screen. They showed how the land had changed, step by step, decade by decade, drawn by the hands of 3 men who had spent their lives walking the same paths and looking at the same hills. Alma asked if he would take her on one of his walks before he stopped. She wanted to see how he looked at the land, not on paper, but in person. She wanted to understand the process from the beginning, from the walking, before the pen ever touched the page. Tobias looked surprised. His face did not change much. He was not a man of large expressions, but his eyebrows lifted slightly, and he was quiet for a moment longer than usual. No one had asked to walk with him in many years. The last person who had walked with him regularly was his wife, who had died 12 years ago. She had not been interested in map-making, but she had loved walking, and she had understood that Tobias needed to see things with his feet before he could draw them with his hands. He said yes. They went out the following Saturday. The morning was cool and bright, with a thin mist hanging in the valley that the sun was slowly burning away. Tobias carried a small leather bag with a notebook, a pencil, and a compass. Alma carried nothing. She wanted her hands free. They walked north out of the town, along the river path, past the old mill and the stone bridge, and the place where the water divided into 2 channels before coming together again on the other side of a small wooded island. Tobias walked slowly. He stopped often. He would stand in one place and look around, not at anything in particular, but at everything, taking in the shape of the land, the way the light fell, the way the trees leaned toward the water.
He told her, as they walked, how he made a map. He did not start with measurements or coordinates. He started with walking. He walked the land first, sometimes several times, until he understood its shape. Not its shape on paper, but its shape in his body. The way the ground rose and fell, the way a path curved to avoid a wet patch, the way a ridge blocked the wind and created a pocket of stillness on the other side. Only after he had walked the land and understood its character would he begin to draw. And even then, the drawing was a kind of conversation with the land, not a reproduction of it. A map, he explained, was always an interpretation. 2 mapmakers could walk the same path and draw 2 different maps, and both would be true, because each would show what that person had noticed and what they had felt. Alma listened carefully. She thought about the maps she worked with at the planning office, the satellite images and GPS coordinates and laser-scanned elevation models. They were accurate in ways that Tobias's maps could never be. They could measure a distance to the centimeter. They could show the exact position of every building, every tree, every fence post. But they did not show what Tobias showed. They did not show why a path went where it went, or what it felt like to walk along a ridge in the early morning, or how a valley changed its mood between winter and summer. They stopped at a point where the river path climbed up to a low ridge. From the top, they could see the whole valley spread out below them, the town, the river, the farms, the dark line of the forest on the far hills. The mist had cleared, and the air was sharp and clean. Tobias stood there for a long time. He took out his notebook and made a few small marks, not a drawing, just notes. The angle of the ridge, the direction of the river, a small cross where a footpath joined the main track. He wrote quickly and without looking down, as if his hand knew what to record without being told. Alma stood beside him and looked at the valley.
She tried to see it the way he saw it, not as a collection of data points, but as a living thing, a place with a character and a history and a shape that had been formed by centuries of water and wind and human hands.
The map of the Old Town Center took Tobias 4 more months to finish. Alma came to the shop when she could, 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes more. She watched the map grow, street by street, building by building, until the old town appeared on the paper the way it had existed half a century ago, before the demolitions and the new road and the parking structures that had replaced the gardens. It was beautiful. Not beautiful in the way a painting is beautiful. It was too precise for that, too grounded in fact. But beautiful in the way that careful work is beautiful, the way that time and attention and skill, applied day after day to the same task, produce something that cannot be produced any other way. There was no shortcut to this map. It could not have been drawn in a week or a month. It could only have been drawn by a man who had spent 50 years learning how to look at the world and put what he saw onto paper. On the day he finished it, Tobias set his pen down and sat back in his chair. He looked at the map for a long time without speaking. Alma was sitting on her stool by the window. She did not speak either. The shop was quiet. The light from the window fell across the table and across the map, and the ink shone faintly where it was still fresh. Tobias told her it was done. His voice was steady, but there was something in it that Alma had not heard before. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of weight. The weight of finishing something that you have spent your life learning how to do. She asked him if he was sure he wanted to stop. He said he was. He said that knowing when to stop was as important as knowing how to begin. A mapmaker who drew past the point where his eyes and hands could do the work properly would make bad maps, and bad maps were worse than no maps at all, because they told lies about the land. He said he would rather stop while his last map was still good than continue until it was not. Alma understood this. She did not agree with it completely. She thought he still had good maps in him, but she understood the principle. It was the same precision he brought to everything, the same care. Even the act of stopping was done with intention.
The maps were donated to the town archive the following spring. The archivist, a careful woman named Dr. Berger, spent 3 weeks cataloging them. There were 412 maps in total, spanning 3 generations and more than a century of work. She told Tobias it was one of the most complete cartographic records of a single valley that she had ever seen. He thanked her quietly and went home. Alma helped with the donation. She carried boxes of maps from the shop to the archive building across the square. She handled each one carefully, the way Tobias had taught her, supporting it from below, never bending it, never touching the ink with bare fingers. Some of the oldest maps, drawn by Tobias's grandfather, were so fragile that they had to be transported between sheets of acid-free tissue paper in special flat cases. After the shop was empty, Tobias locked the door for the last time. He stood on the pavement and looked at the sign above it, Tobias Kern, cartographer, and then he turned and walked home. Alma watched him go. He walked the way he always walked, slowly, steadily, looking around him as he went, noticing things, the crack in the pavement near the bridge, the new sign on the wool shop, the angle of the afternoon light on the river. He was still reading the world the way a mapmaker reads it, not as a place to pass through, but as a place to understand. She went back to her work at the planning office. She opened her computer and looked at the digital survey she had been working on, a precise, efficient, perfectly accurate representation of a new development area on the south side of town. She looked at it for a long time. Then she opened a drawer, took out a sheet of blank paper and placed it on her desk. She picked up a pencil.
She did not know exactly what she was going to draw, but she knew she wanted to draw something. Some piece of the valley, some corner of the town, some path or ridge or bend in the river that she had walked with Tobias, and that lived in her memory in a way that no screen could contain. She put the pencil to the paper. Her hand was not as steady as his, her lines were not as certain, but she began. Outside the window, the valley stretched away toward the mountains. The river moved through the center of it, the way it had always moved, slowly, steadily, carrying with it the reflections of the sky and the trees and the old stone bridge that someone had built long ago because it was needed and because they knew how. The land was still there. It would always be there. The river, the mountains, the old stone bridge, the paths that wound through the forests and along the ridges and down into the valley. And as long as someone was willing to walk it and look at it carefully and try to put what they saw and what they felt onto paper, it would not be forgotten. It would not become just data. It would remain a place, a real place, known and loved and drawn by human hands. Her pencil moved slowly across the paper. The line was not perfect, but it was hers, and it was a beginning.